I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast, where I'm speaking to permaculturist, teacher, speaker and author Graham Burnett. Through his organisation Spiralseed, Graham has been involved with both public and private projects across the globe and has accumulated a huge portfolio of work. He's involved in community activism and community gardening projects and is a pioneer of the somewhat contentious vegan permaculture system, which we touch on at the end of the interview. Graham starts by talking about how he became involved with permaculture.
I first came across the word about, I think it's about 1982, which is showing my age. There used to be a magazine called Peace News. It might still be going, I'm not sure. But there was an article in there one day about this word permaculture that I'd never come across before. And I didn't know what it was. And it was quite an interesting article. And I just kind of filed it away in the back of my brain somewhere and kind of thought about it, really. But then it was fast forwarding to sort of the mid-1990s. I was very involved in kind of activism and stuff like that. And, I've been involved in kind of activism, I suppose, since the late 70s, really, through the whole punk thing, when punk came along. And I was about 16, 17 years old at that time. And that really opened my eyes to kind of the political aspects of punk, like a lot of shouting against what's wrong with the world. I guess that opened my eyes up to a lot of the injustices in the world. And it kind of introduced me to kind of animal rights, concepts like animal rights and things like that as well. And so I got very active through my kind of formative years in kind of political activism against racism, things like Rock Against Racism, as I mentioned, animal rights issues, hunt tagging, and that kind of was my path through, sort of the 1970s, 1980s, and got to sort of mid-1990s, and I guess I was sort of starting to feel that sense of activism burnout, if you know what I mean. It felt like whether we, in air quotes, whether we won or lost on a particular issue, they, air quotes, will always have like the next thing lined up for us. So it's like, a big struggle in the early 90s, late 80s was around things like poll tax. And I think they were kind of quite, we were quite successful in sort of beating the poll tax. But then the next thing comes along, like the Criminal Justice Act. And you can kind of do that for so long and just suddenly reach this kind of, as I say, sort of sense of burnout, really. And I guess I'm starting to ask the question in my head, my whole life up to now has been defined, my adult, life has been defined in terms of what I'm against, what am I actually kind of for? And it was around about that time I picked up a book called The Permaculture Garden, by another Graham Bell, and it kind of, I remember this word I'd read many years before, and I knew it was something to do with kind of permaculture, something to do with herb spirals, something like that. So I picked this book up because I thought it might be nice to, I had an allotment, and I thought it might be nice to have a herb spiral in my allotment, and this book would tell me how to make a herb spiral. And so I picked this book up and read it. It actually didn't have anything about herb spirals in it at all. But what it was all about, what I would call solutions-based thinking. And I guess for me, it was kind of like the switch point, like, where I kind of switched from very oppositional politics, if you like, or oppositional thinking. So what I'm actually for, what I'm actually for in this world. And I guess that book was very much about that. It was that kind of switching point for me. So a little while after that, I did an introduction to permaculture course in London, and then did what's called the full permaculture design course, which is like a 72-hour course, which was over I think it was 7 weekends. And again, that was in London. And through that, got introduced to so many people doing these fantastic projects in London and outside of London, garden-based projects and community projects and alternative economic projects, local exchange trading systems. And it was just like, wow, this is where I want to be kind of putting my energy in the future. And I guess that was my journey into permaculture, I guess.
So what is it about the theory behind permaculture that allies with your desire to stand for something rather than against things?
I think because we've got this real, at the heart of permaculture is very much this core of ethics, earth care, caring for the earth, the natural world, the environment, promoting biodiversity, restoring soils, restoring watercourses, that side of things, tree planting, that side of things. And then we have what's called people care, which is obviously all about the people side of things. How do we meet the needs of people without compromising the needs of the earth, if you see what I mean? And the third ethic is sometimes known as fair shares, which is all about redistributing surplus and setting needs for consumption, or it's sometimes called future care. So thinking, how do we actually meet our needs without not only compromising the needs of the planet, but without compromising the needs of future generations? How do we leave the world a better place for future generations? So it's that kind of core of ethics that really appealed to me and gave me a real sort of grounding in my own kind of, projects and activism. And then there's a whole lot of permaculture principles, which maybe we'll kind of go into a little bit more further down the road in this chat. And then there's all the kind of strategic thinking, there's kind of design thinking in systems, so we can actually see how elements within a system, whether that's a garden system, whether it's a community system, a social system, how they all kind of interconnect with each other and where we can best have leverage within that system for kind of more positive results. Hopefully that's partly answered your question.
Definitely. You spoke about the principles. Do you want to touch on those now?
Yes, so there's lots and lots of principles that are kind of devised from observation of the natural world and how nature functions and how nature solves problems, and other principles that are derived from how other cultures, what works in other cultures that have lived kind of close to the earth, and how can we actually take those principles and apply them in our own situation, whether it is our garden or whether it's our community, our lifestyle, our day-to-day interactions. So I guess the core one really would be work with nature rather than against nature. The dominant culture that we're in at the moment is very much seeing nature purely as a resource to be exploited and for human beings to use in whatever way we see fit to meet our needs. And I think where we're at as a culture can perhaps be defined by Francis Bacon, not the painter Francis Bacon, but the Elizabethan person who's in the court of Queen Elizabeth during the time of the so-called Enlightenment in the 16th century, actually said something along the lines of, we must bend nature to our will. We must put her upon the rack and extract her secrets, which sounds pretty grim, but it's pretty much where we're at still as a culture in our relationship to the natural world. And so I guess the principle of work with nature is basically saying, but sooner or later that attitude is going to come back to bite us. And I think we're seeing that with things like climate change, extreme weather events, maybe this pandemic that's about at the moment. That might be examples of nature coming back to bite us. But also we can meet all of our needs by working with rather than against nature. The problem is the solution is another one I like, in that quite often a situation that appears challenging or problematic, when we kind of maybe look a little bit deeper, the actual solution might be actually contained within that. And sometimes it's just about reframing how we're looking at the world. Bill Morrison, who was one of the co-founders of permaculture, he had a quote, you haven't got an excess of slugs, you've got a duck deficiency, which kind of is turning it around. Another example might be, you might look at your garden and think, I've got a load of stinging nettles growing in my garden. They're a weed, I need to get rid of them. But if we kind of just reframe that, that situation, let's just say, well, we've actually got this, as I'm sure you're aware, stinging nettles are actually an edible plant. You can use them in soups. They've got a lot of medicinal properties. You can use them as a spinach substitute. You can use them like dyes, fibres, all these many uses, wildlife habitat, all sorts of things we can use nettles for. So it's just about reframing sometimes. The problem is the solution. Minimum effort for maximum effect is another one I like, which is the little phrase that goes with that is don't just do something, sit there. And I kind of like that because it's actually turning round that, oh no, that panic response, don't just sit there, do something. But actually, when we actually take time to kind of sit back and observe and see what's really going on in a situation. For example, in your garden, if you've got if you've got too many aphids on your broad beans, and your first response to that might be, I'm going to run down the shop and buy, a bug spray. But we'll actually see what's actually really going on here. Is there something fundamentally out of balance in the ecosystem of your garden that's kind of leading to this being a problem? And I think a lot of these principles, they're kind of within a garden context, but I think they're a metaphor for for wider life. Another principle would be multiple elements times multiple functions, which means that every element within a system should have many functions, and every function within a system should be met by many elements. I'm afraid this isn't a very vegan proverb that goes with it. It's don't put all your eggs in one basket, might be the little kind of proverb or little saying of wisdom that goes around that. Again, I kind of like that because it's something there about resilience and having multiple backups to the system. So if part of your system collapses or goes wrong or doesn't work very well, there's something else that will kind of come into play to back that system up. An example of that might be how we grow crops. It might be that you have an acre of land, and if you use that land to grow just wheat, one strain of wheat, and then one particular year that wheat gets a disease or a pest, you've lost your entire crop for the year, and you kind of either don't get to eat or you've got no crop to take to market. Whereas that same acre of land, if you use it for what we call like a polycultural system rather than a monocultural system, where you're planting like a diversity of crops, you might have some different vegetables growing, you might have various varieties of tomatoes growing, you might have different apple trees growing, pear trees, cherry trees, you might have a area of the site known to like a polytunnel. We can grow salads and things like that in the winter. You might build a classroom or something like that, so you can run courses or run events and get some income from that. So if one part of that system fails that year, like you have a late frost and lose your apple crops, well, never mind, there'll be plenty of tomatoes, or that particular variety of tomatoes didn't do well. Well, we're growing lots of different varieties, and these ones are going to do better. Or this year we had to cancel all our courses because of the coronavirus. Well, kind of never mind, maybe the box scheme, selling the salads to the local community, that'll do well. So it's not being dependent on any one on any one thing within the system too much.
What's great about those principles is that you can apply them to a variety of situations. Like you said, they are kind of, they're applicable across the board, really. Whichever way you look at horticulture, they seem to apply. One thing you spoke about, which was interesting, so you mentioned earth care and you mentioned people care. And when you were talking, I wondered, is there a place in a permaculture garden for a purely ornamental space? And I'm thinking at that from the people care aspect, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Some of the projects I've been involved with have been, I mentioned at the very beginning there that been involved with some kind of community garden projects. It was quite ironic. We actually got funding to actually set up 3 new community garden spaces at the back of 3 properties that are actually run by local social housing. And so it's, I think one of them is like hostel for homeless people. Another is home for adults with complex needs, which is kind of a mixture of learning disability, mental health needs, stuff like that. And the other property, I think, is another kind of halfway house. And to be honest, the people that live in those properties, their priorities aren't always around food growing and stuff, although, there can be a lot of value around that. But I think the main driver is just around actually having a nice space or kind of engagement with nature, people having an opportunity to kind of get their hands in the soil. And so, yeah, I was going to say, it's a bit ironic. We actually got the go-ahead to set up these 3 projects, and the scheduled work day for the same one was the same day. The first one was the same day lockdown came in, so those projects actually kind of sat untouched for months and months and months, and we're only just starting to kind of reopen them up again now. And of course, the way things are going at the moment, I think they might have to close down again. But yeah, so we've been trying to kind of keep those projects going. We've had to apply sort of creative thinking, really. And we kind of thought, well, we've got to this point where people kind of want to do gardening, and they want to get their hands in the soil, and they want to kind of be growing plants, sort of, for therapy and stuff like that. But they can't come to us at the moment. Well, maybe we can go to them. So what we were doing, we were going to a local micro pub down the road from me. And because they kind of, they were reopened and they were doing off-license sales as well during the lockdown. And so we were getting their plastic 30-litre containers, their beer comes in. We were kind of cutting the tops off, filling them up with soil, and then giving this to people, and they could put their own plants and grow flowers and tomatoes and things like that. And that worked really well as a project. I think we gave out about 20 of those to different people that wanted them. And like I say, I mean, I don't think I quite answered your question. It was about ornamental growing, but yeah, a lot of that was just about growing flowers to make people, just as a therapeutic activity, or for people to make their space a little bit more enjoyable in these difficult times.
I think a lot of people assume that permaculture is purely geared around the productive side. So it's interesting to hear what you say that it does encompass all species, and it's there for kind of the use of everyone and the benefit of everyone. So I think particularly, I think particularly in the urban environment as well, at the end of the day, even though we can grow, we can all make a contribution to our own diet. And I think, it's the act of growing, or the process of growing, is as important as the end product. I think, at the end of the day, most of our food is still going to come from, particularly if you're living in towns and cities, most of your food is still going to come from other places than what you're actually going to grow yourself. And I think, we can support kind of local growers, and we can support community growing schemes and things. But at the end of the day, most of what I, for example, can grow on my allotment or in my back garden it's not going to feed me and my family for a year. Does that kind of make sense? But it's more about the process. And I think a lot of the activity I'm involved with is more around kind of
the therapeutic and community side of stuff.
Yeah, no, I get that. And you design vegan permaculture gardens. And for anyone who's not clear about that, could you just explain what that is?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to be clear that, sort of veganism and permaculture aren't kind of synonymous. They're not the same thing. I think it's kind of quite easy to apply the principles of permaculture and the ethics of permaculture and the design systems of permaculture to set up gardens, growing spaces that don't actually involve the exploitation of animals. One of the, a question that's sometimes thrown at me is, well, how can you have a garden without animals? How can that be a thing? And well, that's kind of not what, to me, vegan permaculture is about. I think the idea, how are you going to exclude animals from your system? So, well, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to exclude the earthworms that are kind of breaking down organic matter into soil? Why would I want to exclude the frogs and toads that are coming in and, keeping levels of slugs and pests down? And why would I want to exclude the bees that are coming in doing the pollinating? Because those, they're just going to be there anyway, and if you're actually if you're actually building those kind of ecological gardens, you're actually going to be attracting in more animals, not less animals. But the distinction is that you wouldn't deliberately include animals where the relationship is exploitative. For example, pigs or sheep or cows or even chickens and things like that. And there is a case, I know people who have set up kind of sanctuary spaces. They've got rescue battery chickens, things like that, and they're obviously going to be kind of laying their eggs and stuff like that. And then there might be a debate whether it's kind of okay to eat those eggs or not. I'm not going to particularly get into that debate now, but I think it's about not setting up systems where the relationship is not exploitative with the animals that kind of come in and go. My friend who I teach with, Nicole Vosper, she uses the term self-willed animals. So it's animals that are kind of free to kind of come and go of their own volition, and relationship with them isn't to kind of take from them and be abusive. It's to kind of like, they're there as companions and users of that space just as much as we are. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And it raises another one for me because I garden. I have a vegan garden as well. And there are flashpoints where I think, okay, well, I've planted these brassicas. Now the cabbage white butterflies have turned up. I'm going to have to, in some way, exclude them from getting to those brassicas. And it might sound a bit churlish, but it is a genuine question. How can you do that in a vegan way? It seems to me it's a bit of a conflict there.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, and there can be this kind of almost a conflict of interest. Well, there's a standard answer that is always given by permaculture designers to almost any question, which is it depends. And it sounds like kind of avoiding the question, but it isn't really. It's actually kind of making the point that there isn't a one size fits all solution, I think. In our the vegan permaculture courses that we've been running, I mentioned those three ethics earlier: the earth care, the people care, and the fair shares. And there was another kind of almost a fourth ethic, or a kind of overarching ethic, that was kind of suggested by some of the course students, which was one of do least harm. So I think there's just something there about having, being mindful that you may need to take these interventions to kind of keep the cabbage white butterflies off, or keep to reduce the aphid populations. But it's kind of, if there's kind of mindfulness behind it of why am I doing this? Is there actually a conflict of interest here, or is there another solution? I think it's to kind of go for the least worst option. I think sometimes, and if you're in a situation, quite often, I guess for me personally, if I've planted some cabbages or some broccoli or whatever on my allotment, and the cabbage whites come along and the caterpillars eat my crop and I lose my crop, it's not the end of the day for me. I can go down to the greengrocer or supermarket and buy some broccoli or buy a cabbage. But I guess if you're actually competing for your food source, if you're actually dependent on that, that might be a different question for someone if it's actually their livelihood or if they're actually going to starve if another, a predator. A predator in terms of, that's predating on our crops is kind of, diminishing our crops, our supplies. I kind of quite like another kind of permaculture principle is something kind of the hierarchy of interventions. So it's going from the least, or rather the most preferable intervention to the least preferable. And our kind of preferable intervention would be do nothing. Which goes back to that minimum effort for maximum effect principle as well. So, for example, you planted your runner bean. No, sorry, not your runner beans. You planted your broad beans in early spring, and they're doing well. And then about May time, as anyone who's ever grown broad beans will tell you, like black flies start arriving on them. And it could be first intervention, do nothing, just sit back, see what happens. As I said, it might be something else within the system might come and, ladybirds might come along and deal with that problem. So the system might sort itself out. But it becomes clear that that population of black fly is starting to build up. And if you don't do something about it, you're going to lose all your broad bean crops. So the next level would be what we call the biological intervention, where maybe you're actively encouraging ladybirds to come along or hoverflies, things like that will prey on black fly. So you might be putting in plants that are going to be attracting them in, and then they'll come along and particularly the larvae of ladybirds will eat tremendous amounts of aphids. But it's still clear that's not really working. So the next level would be what we call the physical intervention, where you're actually, very sorry, but if I don't do something, I'm going to lose my crops. So it might be you literally physically wipe the aphids away, wipe the black fly away, or spray them with a bit of soapy water or something. But then that's still not happening, not really being effective. And so our last level, what's sometimes called the chemical intervention, which might be then you do kind of start spraying, kind of nasty chemicals and things. But I guess in a permaculture system, you never kind of rule anything out. But it is sort of if you've got to the level that you have to be that drastic in your intervention, then there was probably something fundamentally wrong in the ecosystem in the first place, and maybe try and get to the root of what that was. So really, I guess it's about if you design your garden well in the first place, hopefully you won't have kind of pest populations getting out of control.
And I think that's where maybe not the ornamental areas, perhaps the wildlife areas would come in, because then you've compensated for excluding your aphids from your beans, and you've left your nettles, because they love those too. Absolutely.
So, and the more you kind of have a garden that's humanised, it's nice and tidy and orderly. One of my permaculture teachers, a guy called Bryn Thomas, he always used to say that those gardens that look kind of nice and tidy and orderly, actually they're in a state of maintained chaos. The system is actually chaotic because nothing's ever balanced there. And it may look nice, but it's actually, that is exactly the environment for what we call, there's a whole issue, what do we call, pests in air quotes again. It's a perfect environment for them. There's all cabbages nicely spaced about. Oh, yeah, I can see that. I've eaten that one. Now I'll go on to the next one. And now there's another one. And there's nothing between them. But if you've got kind of this much more of a polycultural system where there are, ornamental plants or wildlife-friendly plants growing all amongst, it might look chaotic to the human eye, but actually it's a far more orderly system or self-maintaining system.
I think when you establish a garden, any garden, sometimes the received wisdom might be to raze it to the ground and start again if you're making that much of a drastic change. But obviously that throws out pretty much any system that was already there, and I think that's when you can get the proliferation of certain bugs and diseases and all the rest of it. So if you were going to establish a permaculture garden, I think a lot of people I just don't know where to start. But is it something that you could do gradually, and would that be a preferable way of doing it?
Oh, very much so, I'd say, yeah. And actually, back to that principle of minimum effort for maximum effect, it's like, well, what's actually kind of the least, what's the least intervention I can make here? The old rule of if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. So if you've actually got a garden that's, productive and ecologically diverse, and it's meeting your needs in terms of being a place to relax and enjoy yourself, and there's places that the kids can play, or you can do your meditation or yoga or whatever it is you choose to do in your garden. If it ain't broke, kind of don't, in a way you're kind of doing permaculture already, I think. I think the other thing would be about kind of long-term observation as well, which again comes back to that principle of the minimum effort. And the problem is the solution by kind of, that long-term, just observe, take notes, what's happening at different times of the year. And I think that would be my, well, there was a quote from Bill Mollison, the place to start is at the end of your nose. If you get that right, then everything is right. But if you don't get that right, nothing will ever be right. And I kind of really like that quote. You start from where you are, the end of your nose, and
work outwards. So I am, as I say, I am mindful of your time, and I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I won't, because you've probably got things to do. Is there anything that we missed out that you wanted to mention? I didn't go into too much of the kind of backlash that you faced with the permaculture thing, and from non-vegans. But if you're happy to, we can maybe save that for another day. But is there anything?
Yeah, I mean, and I wouldn't kind of overplay that stuff anyway. I kind of quite like that in a way, because it kind of it feeds a debate, which I kind of quite like. I mean, some of it was a bit crazy. I remember when my book first came out, and Permanent Publications were kind of promoting it on their Facebook page and this, that, and the other, and there were these really strange. I was getting these or people were commenting, when's this guy going to stop promoting hate speech and all this kind of stuff? And what? Where did that come from? And yeah, because I personally don't think kind of confrontation and those sort of arguments are particularly productive, really. I kind of don't mind, the debate, and I like that it opens up the debate. And your listeners may be aware of a book that was published a few years back called Meat, A Benign Extravagance by Simon Fairley. I know people are aware of that book. And he's actually I kind of quite like Simon Fairley, and I like his sort of, because he's not vegan, he's kind of quite critical of, he is kind of permaculturist, and he's very involved in the organic movement and stuff like that. And he wrote a particularly good article a few years ago called Can Britain Feed Itself?, which was actually looking at, how the sort of areas of land it would require for the UK to be kind of self-sufficient in food, fibre and fuel in different scenarios. So he looks at an omnivorous diet, and I can't remember what his figures were for an omnivorous diet, with kind of cattle and livestock and stuff like that, and it was so much land that's needed. And then he looks at a kind of what he calls like a chemical vegan diet, so a lot of chemical industrialized agriculture, much as what we've got, but still like vegan centric. And he's come up with some figures for that. And then he comes up with a vegan permaculture scenario, which is kind of organic, self-sufficient, self-reliant, regenerative practices. And I think he comes up with a figure of something like we would need 1/3 of the land that we currently use to kind of meet all our needs, which I kind of quite like that.
Wow.
But as I say, he's not vegan himself, and there's a clue in the title of his book as well, and he's very much into promoting. He argues that the most efficient way of converting not edible to humans vegetable protein into protein that'd be kind of waste food products and things that are too tough for our kind of digestive systems to cope with. The most efficient way of converting that plant biomass into edible to human biomass is feeding it through pigs. And I don't know if he's right or wrong. He may well be right that it's the most efficient way of doing it. But my response to that was, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the most efficient way of cleaning our chimneys was to send little boys up, 5-year-old boys with brushes. But as a culture, hopefully we've moved past that, so it may be efficient, but it doesn't make it right. But I quite like him in that I think he asks some hard questions of the vegan movement, I think, and it makes us as vegans think, how do we respond to that? And I kind of think it's quite good to, rather than just dismissing the hard questions, it's good to be, then we have to kind of come up with some figures to counter, or we have to come up with a moral or ethical answer. So I think those debates are useful, but not particularly useful when it just descends into kind of hate speech on, or people accusing each other of hate speech in the Facebook comments column, that kind of stuff.
I always think, when you said about, if we can't exclude the cabbage whites from our cabbages, then we discard that crop and then we go to the supermarket. And then I always think, as a vegan, but kind of criticising the vegan perspective, I feel when I do that I'm kicking the can down the road. So I've just gone, okay, well, I'm going to let someone else kill those caterpillars, because they are, whatever, even if it's an organic cabbage, they're killing them, I'm sure, because, you can't grow them without, as a monocrop, without doing that. So then I feel bad about that.
Although what I probably did mean to say is if you net them early enough, you should be able to keep the butterflies out. But and another thing, actually, at one of the community gardens I was just talking about, we planted a load of kale and broccoli, and we just couldn't, I'll confess it, we were with the group I was with, which was like a community gardening group of volunteers. We were just picking all the caterpillars off, and putting them on another plant where they probably wouldn't survive. But anyway, that's kind of what we did. But actually, we lost the battle, and they totally devastated the broccoli and the kale. And he said, "Oh well, so it goes." And then the following spring, it all kind of regrew anyway, and did really well. So it's almost like just a temporary setback for them.
Sometimes you just need to get out of nature's way, get out of your own way, and avoid the desire to micromanage every process in the garden system. And honestly, who wouldn't want to do that when it involves so much less stress and work? I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a bug that stars in many an urban legend. If you didn't talk to someone who knew someone that had one of these secretly living in one of their orifices, you must have grown up on the moon.
Often found resting during the day in moist locations under rocks, dead plant material, and various nooks and crannies around the garden, are the earwigs. These 15mm long shiny brown insects, sporting an impressive pair of pincers on the end of their bodies, are mainly nocturnal scavengers that feed on decaying plant material, carrion, and small insects such as aphids. But unfortunately, they'll also sometimes feed on the petals of certain plants such as dahlia, chrysanthemum, and clematis. Despite having the appearance of an aggressive insect, earwigs are actually quite docile, and primarily use their pincers just for defence. Yet unlike most other non-social insects, earwigs dotingly care for their young, carefully protecting their 40 to 50 eggs throughout the winter, until they hatch into little white nymphs that they then feed and tend to until they're ready to look after themselves. Knowing this, It may seem sad that earwigs are often controlled when they're damaging flowers in the garden, but this doesn't have to involve killing them, since they can easily be trapped alive if need be, by loosely filling a few empty drink bottles with strips of damp paper, then inverting them on bamboo canes amongst the affected plants. The earwigs will then crawl into the bottles when the sun begins to rise, and can be collected and relocated accordingly. In fact, besides being just a sporadic plant pest, earwigs contribute greatly to the composting and recycling processes in our gardens, so could be deemed more beneficial than bad. However, centuries ago, during medieval times, earwigs were often feared by people, as they were wrongly assumed to be spreading diseases and venomous. In addition, the medieval folk believed that whilst they slept, earwigs would crawl into their ears and begin tunnelling inside their heads. And so this is the reason why they were called earwigs, wig being the Old English word for wiggler. And this belief wasn't just here in Britain, since the French named them ear piercers and the Germans earworms. But was there any truth in this myth? Well, nowadays we all know that earwigs don't actively search out our ears at night, and even if one did accidentally enter an ear, it certainly wouldn't burrow into our head. But many years ago, our medieval ancestors, who may have slept on a bed of straw on the ground, might well have unwittingly provided earwigs with a couple of safe, moist havens to rest within during the day.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.